Hello, this is Jeffrey Williams, and welcome to Too Late for the Gods. I somehow end up in a lot of debates with Christian apologists and have long insisted on a clear distinction between philosophers and apologists. Philosophers strive to examine reality in order to come to a better understanding of humanity and our relation to the universe. Apologists strive to distort the truth of man and the universe in order to justify their faith in a declining religion, declining at least in the West. A clear example of that difference is the contrast between classical foundationalism and its perversion by apologists, clothed in the language of philosophy under the banner of Reformed epistemology. Most prominently featured in this trivialization of philosophy is the apologist Alvin Plantinga. A recent debate on the rationality of the belief in God appeared on the Modern Day Debate channel, which is linked below. I won't go into the actual debate itself, but will instead focus on the opening statements of the two apologists, Randal Rauser and Samuel Nissan, which I think neatly illustrate the falsity of Reformed epistemology. I'll start with a somewhat superficial overview of both classical foundationalism and Reformed epistemology in the interest of time, but would be very happy to go into a more detailed discussion or debate with Rauser, Nissan, or any other adherent. Classical foundationalism is a rigorous school of thought in epistemology. It aims to prevent an infinite regression in the chain of justifying premises by dividing proper beliefs into proper basic beliefs, which can always serve as a premise, and non-basic beliefs, which are rational when derived logically from properly basic beliefs. According to classical foundationalism, a properly basic belief must fall into one of three categories: evident to the senses, incorrigible, or self-evident. What this really means is it must be objectively verifiable or a condition of thought itself. Reformed epistemology commandeers the nomenclature of classical foundationalism, but aims to weaken the standards for determining a properly basic belief by adding new categories and blurring the definition of others. In a sense, it's a return to pre-Enlightenment mysticism and metaphysics. This effort developed out of frustration with the apologists' inability to overcome the evidentialist demands of foundationalism. The argument always went, belief in God requires the right kind of evidence in order to be rational. No such evidence exists for belief in God, therefore belief in God is not rational. Having tried in vain to provide evidence of God, apologists such as Plantinga took the bold step of challenging the first premise by obscuring the definition of evidence or even denying the need for evidence in order to satisfy the second premise. Their counter-argument becomes belief in God requires the right kind of evidence in order to be rational. Such evidence does exist for rational belief in God. Therefore, belief in God is rational. The mechanism for this attempt became its central claim that religious belief can be rational without any appeal to evidence or argument, primarily by promoting testimony as warranting belief. To anyone other than an apologist, it should be immediately obvious that the word rational becomes grossly distorted when applied to any process that discards evidence and argument. To carry this out, Plantinga and others blur the distinction between sense data and subsequent judgment and interpretation, equate the validity of external sense data with internal subjective feelings, embrace the fallacy of argumentum ad populum by asserting that a majority of believers in a God is evidence of its existence, and ground this claim on an assertion that an innate special sense beyond the five senses, which Plantinga calls sensus divinitatis, a term he borrows from Calvin, exists as experience of God's presence and is as valid as any other objective observation. In other words, they transform the term rational into subjective feeling and interpretation, and only under this sleight of hand can the apologist argue that belief in God is rational. Let's look at parts of Rauser and Nissan's opening statements to illustrate the tricks I just mentioned.
Now, one can define rational belief both in negative terms and in positive terms. Negatively, a rational belief is a belief the holding of which violates no epistemic duties.
First of all, Rauser presents the term epistemic duties. Actually, there is disagreement among philosophers whether such duties even exist, and if so, just what they are. What Rauser presents here is an impressive sounding claim to shift the burden of proof from the claimant to anyone who questions the claim.
Positively, a rational belief is any belief that is either properly non-basic or properly basic. A properly non-basic belief is a belief that is rational and justified as the valid conclusion to a reasoning process. Think by analogy of a mathematical theorem. A properly basic belief is a belief that is rational and justified if formed in the right circumstances, independent of a reasoning process. Think by analogy of a mathematical axiom, a starting point for reasoning. It is clear that not all beliefs could be properly non-basic, because if every belief could only be justified as the conclusion of a reasoning process of supportive premises, then those premises in turn would have to be supported by prior premises, and you would immediately fall into an infinite regress, an ad infinitum list of justifications for any belief. And that would result in skepticism, that you could believe nothing at all rationally. Consequently, there must be properly basic beliefs as starting point for reasoning. Now, properly basic beliefs come in many types. Here is a partial list. Number one, there are no married bachelors. That is an analytic belief. 2, 7 + 5 = 12. That's a synthetic a priori belief. 3, it is raining outside. That is a sense perceptual belief. 4, I had cereal for breakfast. That would be a memorial belief. 5, it is wrong to torture a person. That would be a morally intuitive belief. And finally, 6, the restaurant is 6 blocks west. Now, number 6 is an example of a belief that would be formed, in this case, by way of testimony. Under the right circumstances, when another human being testifies to the truth of a proposition, then if you have no reason to distrust that human being as a witness, if they seem to be a credible witness, if there's no undercutting or rebutting defeaters, in other words, no reasons to reject their witness, then you are justified in accepting it and forming your belief based on it. Now, keep in mind that all sources of belief, whether basic or non-basic, are fallible. But the mere possibility that rational intuition or sense perception or testimony can fail you does not undercut our general warrant for accepting these sources of belief, barring any specific reasons to question them in a particular case.
See how he adds another category to the list from classical foundationalism: testimony. Further, to excuse the diminished validity of testimony, he quickly adds that all sources of belief are fallible, paving the way for the false equivalency between objective evidence and testimony. He then asserts that we must believe testimony in absence of any particular failure in epistemic duty. Again, the burden of proof is on the questioner, not the claimant. This can be seen in his often used example of asking for directions to a restaurant. In this example, a stranger tells him there is one 6 blocks away. We should immediately see the relationship between statement and consequences and the presumption of knowledge. In our assumption that the stranger is a local, we take for granted he has actually seen this restaurant through direct observation and knows its location. While it is possible that assumption doesn't hold, or that the stranger is maliciously imparting false information, The investment of a 6-block trip is trivial and worth the risk. This is not analogous to relying on mere testimony concerning a question of life-changing significance, and especially so when there is no reason to believe any real evidence other than testimony exists.
Now let's apply testimony to our question here. Imagine two parents, Amber the atheist and Chris the Christian. Amber teaches her child that God does not exist, while Chris teaches his child that God does exist. If there are no defeaters to the testimony of which either child is aware, then each child is justified in forming a belief in the proposition in question based simply on the testimony of their parent. Amber's child could be rational to believe that God does not exist based upon that testimony, and Chris's child could be rational to believe that God does exist.
Here he gives an odd example of rational belief in children in their blind acceptance of the belief of the parents. The first obvious objection is that we assume that children lack requisite rationality and therefore are protected until maturity. There can be no such thing as rational belief in this case. Even more disturbing, however, is the implication that adults also are rational in conceding warrant to testimony and irrational in skepticism. I can't stress this point strongly enough. This is a perfect example of the difference between apologetics and philosophy. Apologists are poles apart from Socrates' statement that the unexamined life is not worth living. In fact, philosophers are in the business of questioning things, not simply accepting testimony. The bit about the absence of defeaters is just one more attempt to shift the burden of proof.
Keep in mind that belief in God, by our definition, is held by the vast majority of people on earth. Educated intellectuals and lowly farmers, or uneducated farmers, well, educated in the soil perhaps, but not in the technicals of philosophy. Highly educated scientists and housewives or house husbands, Oxbridge philosophers, small children, Nobel laureates, refugees, heads of state. Literally billions of people believe in God. Now, many of these people come to believe in God in just this way because of a trusted authority. A parent or a philosopher, a teacher or a scientist attests to the belief in God, and they form that belief based upon that testimony in a basic fashion rather than through a process of discursive reasoning. It seems quite clear that such belief can, in principle, be properly basic.
Pure fallacy of argumentum et populum. The admission that many come to that belief through mere testimony is actually damaging to the claim of rationality of belief in God. Next comes Samuel Nissan with an attempt to confuse rationality with mysticism and emotions.
Since the topic of today's debate is not whether the Christian God exists, but whether there are sufficient reasons for one to believe in God, I'll be presenting one argument called the argument from religious experience. By religious experience, I mean a subjective experience in which a person apprehends themselves to stand in relation to what they may consider to be the divine. Richard Swinburne, professor of philosophy at Oxford University, lists 5 kinds of religious experiences from the perspective of the one experiencing it. The first, public, ordinary experiences of God. This would be akin to seeing a mountain or seeing the ocean, or even if you've taken a flight before, seeing the clouds and just feeling this sense of grandeur that must be a great creative God who put all these things in place, and thus experiencing God from these ordinary objects.
This is a classic example of confusing sense data with interpretation. Everybody has felt the emotion of being overcome by grandeur beyond our comprehension. That is an emotional reaction to sense data that overwhelms our limited understanding. We are prone to go further and interpret or impute significance to that emotion, and do so in countless ways, one of which is to attribute it to God. This interpretation is neither rational nor warranting of belief.
The second would be public extraordinary experiences of God mediated through unusual and uncommon uh, objects. For example, seeing a bush on fire that is not consumed by the fire. I'm of course referring to the incident, for example, that Moses describes as the burning bush experiences, or just miracles in general would qualify as a public extraordinary experience of God.
This illustrates the next problem of testimony, the source. The burning bush is told of in a biblical story. We actually have no real testimony here, as is the case with almost all of the Bible. To suggest that this could count as testimony is deeply subversive to rationality. The references to miracles is a subcategory of my point about false interpretation of things that overwhelm our limited understanding. In other words, God of the gaps.
The third would be private describable experiences, by which, of course, I mean that experiences mediated through private sensations that can be described in sensory normal language. Take, for example, the famous analogy of Paul on the road to Damascus seeing a vision of Jesus, or just visions or dreams in general qualify as a private describable experience. There's also number 4, private non-describable experiences. For example, experiences that people have about God that cannot be described or captured by literal language. So the fifth would be non-specific experiences of God that is not mediated by any sensations, where the person claims to be intuitively and immediately aware of God's presence.
Here he repeats the insistence that vague feelings as well as hallucinations are sufficient evidence. There are few things as fallible as subjective or inner experience. Inner physical sensation is inexact as when we mistake an appendicitis attack for intestinal distress. Inner psychic sensation is even more fallible, susceptible to unconscious thoughts, bias, and misperceptions. When we add in susceptibility to paranoia, projection, and various other defense mechanisms, testimony of private experience becomes extremely unreliable.
So based on these 5 religious experiences, I submit the following argument. Premise 1, many people from various times and cultures have claimed religious experiences.
As for premise 1, many people have been wrong in their claims, often entire populations over some period of time. The German people of the 1930s claimed a spiritual experience supporting the glory of the Thousand-Year Reich.
Premise 2, it is reasonable to believe these religious experiences unless we have evidences that they are mistaken. Now, this premise is based on 2 principles of rationality. The first is called the principle of credulity. The principle of credulity simply means that we ought to believe things as they seem apparent to us unless we have evidences that they are mistaken. In other words, the rational person is one who treats their basic cognitive processes as innocent until there's reason to doubt. Unwarranted skepticism is unhelpful in the pursuit of truth. The second principle of rationality is called the principle of testimony, and Randal has just shared a little bit about it. By testimony, I mean that those who do not have religious experiences, have not experienced it themselves, ought to believe what others who do, ought to believe the vast majority of people who do, in the absence of evidences of deceit or delusion. For example, in this pandemic, I've not seen the coronavirus, and I doubt many of you watching from home have not seen the coronavirus yourself. But it's rational to believe that this thing is out there, even though we have not observed it with our own eye. Students, for example, in school can rationally believe whatever their teachers teach them in the absence of evidences that would cause them to cast doubt on what is being taught. So I'm just applying the same principle to religious experiences.
In that case, we would have to accept the testimony of the German people I just referenced, the followers of Moloch, and other such nonsense. And the scene then reprises Rauser's trick of false citing of authority. He asserts two alleged principles of rationality, the principle of credulity and the principle of testimony. No such principles are generally accepted in philosophy, but instead are the creations of apologists such as Plantinga. They are without force, they obscure the psychological fallibility of man, and merely repeat the demand to shift burden of proof and make the profoundly anti-philosophical claim that skepticism is unwarranted in the face of testimony. The example of the COVID-19 in support of the second premise is absurd. It is rational to believe in its existence, not merely by testimony, but by the observation of 120,000 U.S. deaths in 4 months, acquaintances and relatives contracting the virus, and mass burials in New York City. Compare this to the testimony that vaccines cause autism. The ridiculous claim that students can simply believe what teachers tell them again contradicts everything that motivates philosophy, but fits well with the apologist's need to conform to dogma. Rauser presented a video the day after the debate in which he explains why he did not invoke sensus divinitatis the night before. It isn't because he doesn't believe it, but because he doesn't want to expose himself to the obvious objection of magic. Those were his literal words. I've linked to his video below, and I suggest that you watch it in its entirety.
Now, here's where I get to the point I want to talk about in this video, because often what Christian epistemologists have done when they argue that first part is, I think, under the influence of Alvin Plantinga, they focus in particular on the idea of a sensus divinitatis, saying it in a very pretentious way, the sensus divinitatis. So the idea that we could have a cognitive faculty in which we can perceive the divine or sense the divine, we can sense God in some way, and based upon that sensory input, then just as I look out at the window today and I see it's raining out and I form the immediate rational justified belief that it is raining, so I experience in some particular circumstance the presence of God, the love of God, the comfort of God, something like that, and I form the immediate belief, well, God loves me or God cares for me. Now, one interesting detail about that, by the way, is that belief in God as such is not typically understood to be properly basic by way of the sensus divinitatis. Rather, the idea is that particular beliefs about God are those which are properly basic. And so then you can infer God's existence by implication from those beliefs. So technically, we're not saying typically belief in God itself is that which is properly basic, but rather the existence of God is the implication of that which is properly basic. So in the same way that when I look out the window, I don't form the belief that weather exists or rainy days exist and therefore conclude this is a rainy day. Rather, I look out the window and see it's raining today, and an implication of that is that there are rainy days. In the same way, you might have the properly basic belief, God loves me, and based upon that belief, by implication, it follows that God exists.
I've already discussed the fallacy of concluding God from inner emotional experience. I hardly need to point out the absurdity of his denying that the claim, God loves me, already assumes the existence of God and merely asserts an attribute of that existence. Again, Rauser tries to impress the ignorant with an argument that is invalid. He then goes on to claim the existence of senses beyond the 5 we know by confusing senses with ability.
So if your ability to proprioceptive begins to decline, as it may, let's say in older age, you start bumping into things, for example, or you might trip, but your ability to proprioceptive is your ability to navigate space. And that's not simply among the 5 senses, that's an additional ability that we have. Another ability that I think we have is an ability to perceive danger. And that's not simply one of the 5 senses. Now, is this sense that we can detect danger a distinct sense? Well, it's not simply sense perception. Right? It's something else is going on here. It's not simply smell, touch, sight. There does seem to be an additional ability to extract data from the environment that is going on there. So I think we need to recognize that our ability, our senses, may be much more diverse than we initially recognize.
The ability of proprioceptive is not a sense, but a neural process that relies on senses. There is a colloquial expression to sense danger, but what really happens is an emotional reaction from the amygdala to sense data, of which the primitive amygdala is the first stop. It is an emotional judgment of the fight or flight response and not a proper sense. He follows this with a ridiculous analogy to these claimed extra senses.
But I like supernatural stuff that kind of explores the liminal dimensions of human existence. And one theme, of course, in many of those films is that certain people have a particular ability to perceive aspects of reality, like seeing dead people. If you remember The Sixth Sense, I see dead people. Or The Shining, right? Danny has the shine. The film The Gift is another one where it centers on a woman played by Kate Blanchett who has a ability to like a clairvoyance. And that's an interesting question. Some people have that kind of ability, or do we all have it to some degree and some people have it more? Those are interesting questions. So we could have all sorts of cognitive faculties or doxastic processes, belief-forming actions that give us properly basic belief about them. But I don't appeal to the sensus divinitatis when I am in debates and I want to argue about proper basicality in Christian belief. And there's a good reason why. There's a good reason why I didn't talk about it in my debate with Matt Dillahunty and Tom Jump. And the reason I didn't talk about it is because you open yourself up to the charge of magic or another way.
I think that is an appropriate place to end. I would just repeat that apologetics is not philosophy, but an impostor in philosophical robes. Reformed epistemology is not philosophy, but dishonest apologetics, and its creators, such as Plantinga, are not philosophers or worthy of serious consideration.